In 1978, 49-year-old Georgy Markov, who was originally from Bulgaria, was living in London and working as a reporter for the British Broadcasting Company, or BBC for short. Georgy had moved to London 6 years earlier, and in the early days of him being in the UK, he would always take a cab or a bus to work. But over the last couple of years, he had taken to walking to work. Not only was it great exercise, but he also just loved the scenery. In particular, he liked on his commute to stop on the Waterloo Bridge, this very famous bridge in London, where from that position he had a beautiful view of the Westminster Palace on one side, and he had the iconic London Eye on the other, which is a very famous Ferris wheel. So on the morning of September 7th of that year, Georgy got up and he left his flat, and he began his typical commute into work. However, by the time he reached the Waterloo Bridge and was getting ready to take in the sights, it had started to rain, and Georgy did not have an umbrella. And so instead of sightseeing, he just kept on walking as quickly as he could to try to get to his office before he got completely soaked. But by the time he was just on the other side of the Waterloo Bridge and still had quite a distance to cover to get to work, the skies had completely opened up. And so as much as Georgy wanted to walk, because this was something he really enjoyed, he decided it was not worth it. And so he began looking for a bus stop, and he found one pretty quickly, and he rushed over to it. There was an awning that the commuters could stand underneath, and so he ran underneath this awning, getting out from under the rain, and then he proceeded to wait for the next bus to take him the rest of the way. As he stood there waiting, he suddenly felt a shooting pain in the back of his right thigh. And instinctively, without even knowing what it was, he just reached down and grabbed his leg, but he couldn't feel anything. And then he tried to kind of look around and look down at his leg, but it was just too crowded around him, so he really couldn't do it. And so he's standing there puzzled, still grabbing at his leg, wondering what could have caused this pain. And the only things he could think of were, maybe someone near him had a pen or a pencil out and they accidentally poked him, or maybe it's some sort of bug that bit him, a spider or a bee or something. He didn't know, but there weren't that many scenarios that made sense to him. But before he could spend very much time dwelling on what had caused this, the bus arrived and Georgy turned around, he hopped on board, and by the time the bus pulled up in front of his office building and he had gone through the doors of the BBC, Georgy had effectively forgotten about this pain in his leg. But when he got up to his actual desk and sat down on his chair, when the underside of his thigh made contact with his chair, it sent that shooting pain into his leg, and immediately he noticed it. It was almost like he had a splinter stuck in the back of his thigh, and by pressing it down on the seat, it was driving that splinter deeper into his leg. And so Georgy stood up immediately, and he's grabbing at the back of his leg, and he's kind of craning his head to look down at the back of his leg, but he doesn't see anything there. And so he's standing there wondering what he should do. He's got a really busy day ahead of him, and he's thinking, should I maybe go to the bathroom and see what this is? But then he tells himself, you're overthinking it. This has got to be something minor. I need to get to work. And so he sat back down in his chair, being very careful with his right leg when he placed it down so as not to press too hard on the spot that hurt. And then he just got to work. And over the course of several hours, even though he knew there was kind of a dull, aching pain in the back of his leg, he mostly forgot about it. He was just doing his job. But by the second half of the day, in the early afternoon, the pain in his leg had become so excruciating that Georgy was literally gritting his teeth and sweating profusely in order to try to ignore the pain. But at some point, it just became too much. He couldn't focus on work, and so he stood up, he left his desk, and he walked down the hall, and he went into the single-stall bathroom. And once he went inside and he shut the door behind him, he pulled his pants down and turned around and looked in the mirror to use the reflection to look at the back of his leg. And right away, there was a little bit of a relief there, because what he saw was a little bit of redness, a little bit of swelling, but nothing significant. It looked very much like someone must have hit him with a pencil by accident, or maybe it was a bee sting or a spider bite or something, but whatever it was definitely minor, at least in Georgy's mind. And so he pulls his pants back up, he tucks his shirt back in, he leaves the bathroom and goes back to his desk. And then he sits down, and despite this intense pain in his leg, he's convinced himself it's no big deal, and so he just kind of grits his way through the rest of his workday. When he finally got home again and walked through the door, Georgy's wife looked at him and was like, "What's wrong with you?" He was so pale, he was sweating profusely, he looked awful. And so he told her about what had happened with his leg, and he was still trying to kind of write it off. But she told him, "Georgy, You are sick. There's something wrong. We have to go to the hospital right now. And so at this point, Georgie was miserable, and so he agreed to go. And so the pair, they made their way over to the emergency room at the hospital. They go inside, and a doctor pulled Georgie into an exam room and said, okay, tell me what's going on. Why are you here? And Georgie would explain how in his morning commute, he had stopped at this bus stop and then felt this shooting pain. And then he told the doctor, I'm pretty convinced this is someone who might have accidentally jabbed me with a pen or a pencil, or it's a bug bite, a spider bite. I don't know what it is, but I'm convinced it's something minor. And so the doctor, he hears this, and he asks Georgie to stand up, pull his pants down so the doctor can get a look at the site. And so Georgie does. He gets up, he drops his pants, and then as the doctor bends down and begins looking at the back of his thigh, Georgie kind of turns around and looks down, and he's shocked at what he sees. Even though he does not have a full view of the back of his leg, it's obvious that the swelling and redness on the back of his leg has grown exponentially. It looks totally horrible. And so after a couple of minutes of the doctor looking at the back of his leg, the doctor stands up and looks puzzled and tells Georgie, hold on a minute, I need somebody else to get a look at this. And so the doctor goes out into the main hall. He comes back with another doctor, and that doctor comes over. He bends down and he looks at the back of Georgie's leg as well. And after the two of them kind of talk to each other and they're looking at the back of his leg, they stand up and they walk around and they're facing Georgie now. And they say, okay, this is going to sound totally weird, but when you were at the bus stop, before you felt the pain in your leg, was anyone around you holding a snake or a reptile? I know that sounds crazy, but the mark on the back of your leg looks exactly like a venomous bite. So Georgie's like, no, I didn't see anyone with snakes or reptiles. There was nothing out of the ordinary about what was happening around me when I felt this pain in my leg. We were all just standing there, and then I felt it in my leg. That was it. And so the doctors would tell Georgie that, they didn't really know what was going on with his leg. And so the best thing to do here is just to admit him to the hospital and monitor him and, try to run some tests on him and try to make him comfortable. And so that night, Georgie was admitted to the hospital. He was set up in his own hospital room. And right away, the nurses and doctors began administering different combinations of medicines and treatments to try to lower the swelling and the pain in his leg. But it just seemed like nothing was working. And so all night, his condition seemed to get worse, not better. And then the next day, when he woke up, his leg was much, much worse. It was extremely swollen. It almost looked like a balloon that had been completely filled. It was very red. And Georgie himself was also beginning to lose touch with reality. He had become convinced that someone had tried to kill him, and that was why he was so sick. And this delusion of his got so extreme that he was afraid of his doctors and nurses. And so it became a big challenge trying to help him because he was effectively fighting them off. By the next day, Georgie's condition overall had become critical. He was very clearly on the brink of death, and his mind was effectively gone. But the doctors and the nurses really had no idea what was going on with him, and so there was nothing they could do to help him. And then on the last day he was in the hospital, the third day, Georgie would die. His body just shut down. Given the strangeness of Georgie's death, his body was sent for an autopsy to try to figure out what had caused that leg pain, because that seemed to be the trigger that ultimately killed him. And sure enough, during the autopsy, the coroner made a surprising discovery. Buried in the back of his right leg, right underneath the site that was where he felt the pain, was this little piece of metal. It was so small, the coroner actually almost didn't see it. But when he did see it, he put it under the microscope, and what he saw was this obviously man-made metallic disc that had these two small reservoirs drilled into it. And so they sent this disc off for further testing, and what they discovered was there was ricin residue inside of those two reservoirs. Ricin is an extremely powerful poison. It is more lethal than cyanide, and it has no antidote. And the symptoms of ricin poisoning often look like the symptoms of other diseases or illnesses, and so it's very difficult to diagnose. And so as a result of these factors, ricin is a very popular poison for assassinations. And the belief is that that is exactly what happened to Georgie. He was assassinated. But to this day, we don't actually know who assassinated him. However, the running theory is that Georgie, who was a reporter for the BBC, he covered politics, and he often spoke very critically about the Soviet Union. And so this theory goes that the Soviet Union's intelligence agency, known as the KGB, they assassinated Georgi for what he was writing about. Adding credence to this theory, a former KGB officer named Oleg Kaligan, who was exiled to the United States in 1991, he claimed that he oversaw the assassination program that targeted Georgy Markov. He said what they did is they put this little tiny disc, that metal disc with the ricin inside of it, they put that at the tip of an umbrella, and they made sure the disc itself was fairly sharp. And then the KGB assassin with this umbrella simply followed Georgy on his typical morning commute, and then when he stopped at that bus stop, the assassin jabbed him in the back of the leg and then faded into the crowd. According to Oleg, those little metallic discs that had the ricin inside of them, they were actually covered with a thin layer of wax, and only when this disc had been placed inside of the target's body would their body heat melt that wax layer off, exposing the poison, and then their target would die several days later, as Georgy did. However, Oleg's story, despite being as compelling as it was, didn't have any hard proof to back it up. And so to this day, there has been no one officially charged with Georgy Markov's murder. Our next story is called Professional Job. In 2000, Mary Lou Morris was a 48-year-old loan officer at a Chase Bank in Houston, Texas. On the morning of October 12th, Mary Lou said goodbye to her husband, Jay, and she headed off to work. That afternoon, Jay gave his wife a phone call, but she didn't pick up. He left her a message, and she never got back to him. This was very unlike Mary Lou, and so Jay was a little bit concerned. At 5 p.m., when he still hadn't heard from her, Jay called her back, but again, she didn't pick up. So Jay called Mary Lou's supervisor, who informed Jay that Mary Lou had actually not come to work that day, and they couldn't get in touch with her either. Jay immediately knew something was wrong, and he called the police. The police had not even begun searching for her when a call came into the station from an ATV rider that happened to be on a road about 3 miles away from Mary Lou's house. And he said he spotted a smoldering car, and it looks like there's someone in the driver's seat that's obviously deceased. Earlier that day at about 10 a.m., the fire department had gotten a call about smoke in that area, but they assumed it was a controlled burn, so they didn't investigate. When the police arrived on scene, it was impossible to tell who the person was that was sitting in the driver's seat, but they were able to find a tooth fragment, and they used that to confirm that it was in fact Mary Lou Morris. It was quickly determined that this was most likely a homicide, and her attacker had probably set this up to make it appear like it could have been self-inflicted. Gasoline had been poured all over Mary Lou and all over the vehicle. However, because of how badly damaged the car and she was, they couldn't determine a cause of death, so they weren't sure if she was deceased when she was placed in the car and it was lit on fire, or if she was in the car and the fire was the cause of death. A number of Mary Lou's valuables were still inside of the car, but her wedding ring was not on her finger. Mary Lou's family and the community at large were shocked. They just could not understand why anybody would want to target such a nice person that had no enemies. The day after Mary Lou's death, a local Houston newspaper received an anonymous call from a guy who just said Mary Lou's death was an accident. And the newspaper tried to get more information, but the person hung up and they couldn't trace the call. At the same time this drama was unfolding for Mary Lou Morris, another drama was unfolding for another Houston woman with the same name. 39-year-old Mary McGinnis Morris was a successful nurse practitioner who by and large got along with all of her coworkers with one exception. A new employee at the clinic, a male nurse named Dwayne Young, was making her feel really uncomfortable. One day when Mary McGinnis got back to her desk, she found all of her pictures of her family had been flipped onto their faces, and in the middle of her desk was a piece of paper that just said death to her. And she knew right away this had to be Dwayne, but she had no way to prove it. And so that night when she went home, she told her husband, Mike, about this guy, Dwayne, and she said, I don't feel safe at work. Can you teach me how to shoot a gun? And so he did. He taught her how to shoot a gun, and then he went out and got a pistol, and she tucked it under her driver's seat in her car just in case. On October 16th, so 4 days after Mary Lou Morris was found dead, and 3 days after that anonymous phone call to the newspaper, Mary McGinnis Morris was at a drugstore after work. And as soon as she went inside, she noticed there was this strange man on the other side of the store that was just watching her. She called her best friend Lori to tell her that there was this strange guy and wanted to know what to do. And Lori said, wait for him to leave. But the guy didn't leave. He just stayed in the store and stared at Mary. And so eventually Mary said, you know what? I'm just going to pay for my stuff and get out of here. I got to stop by the office, but I'll be home in just a few minutes. I'll be totally fine. And so Mary hangs up. She buys what she needs. She leaves the store. And then 12 minutes later, she places a frantic 911 call saying someone's trying to kill her. And this 911 call was not made public because apparently on the tape, you can actually hear her being attacked. Mary McGinnis was found later that night in her car. She was deceased. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. It was clear from her 911 call that she had been attacked, and so this was almost certainly a homicide. However, her attacker tried to stage it so it looked like it was self-inflicted. The murder weapon, which was actually her pistol that was tucked underneath her seat, had been placed next to her hand on the seat next to her. None of Mary McGinnis's valuables were stolen. However, her wedding ring was missing from her finger. After Mary McGinnis Morris's death, people began to speculate that her death and Mary Lou Morris's death were connected. Specifically, this was a professional hit gone wrong. The reasoning for this theory is there was just too many coincidences. They shared the same name, they lived in the same city, they were killed within days of each other, and both of their deaths were staged to look like they were self-inflicted. And each woman was missing their wedding ring, which apparently is a common way for professional hitmen to let their clients know that the job was done. The people that subscribe to this theory believe Mary McGinnis Morris was the intended target and Mary Lou Morris was just an accident. And in fact, after killing Mary Lou Morris, the hitman must have realized, whoops, I made a mistake, and they called the newspaper to say, literally, that was a mistake. And then a couple of days later, the hit was successfully carried out on Mary McGinnis Morris. The police looked into this theory and they discovered that Mary McGinnis's husband, Mike, had recently accused her of cheating on him, and he was really, really upset about it. He also refused to take a polygraph test and would not allow his daughter to talk to the police. And Mary McGinnis had a $700,000 life insurance policy that Mike was in line to receive. And so immediately everybody's like, okay, obviously Mike put a hit out on his wife and that's what started this whole thing. But when they dug into it, they realized that no matter how upset Mike was, there wasn't any evidence that tied him to the killing of his wife or to Mary Lou Morris. And so he was ruled out as a suspect. As for Mary McGinnis's co-worker, Dwayne Young, who wrote "Death to Her" on her desk, it was clear that he did not like Mary, but he was ruled out as a suspect as well. And unfortunately, that's where both of these cases go cold. To date, no one's ever been charged in either murder.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Dispatch.
Early on the afternoon of October 12, 1960, a 17-year-old high school student named Otoya Yamaguchi stood alone in his brother's house in the city of Tokyo, Japan, waiting for a tea kettle of water to boil. It was a Wednesday, so Otoya should have been at school, but that day he had gone to school and then snuck out a side door during lunch. More and more often these days, Otoya was feeling like school was kind of meaningless. It was hard for him to sit in history class and watch all of his classmates diligently take notes when, in Otoya's mind, he felt like all the real history was happening outside of the classroom. Just then, the kettle on the stove began to whistle, which meant the water was boiling, and so Otoya grabbed the kettle, he took it off the burner, and he poured it over a tea bag in a cup. And as Otoya began to stir his tea, he began to go over what he was going to do later that day. It was undeniable that Otoya had a very difficult afternoon in store. He had a meeting with a person who was very important, and during this meeting, Otoya would have to deliver some very bad news. In fact, this news was so bad that Otoya had decided, what he was going to do was literally write down this bad news and hand deliver it. Now, Otoya had not quite figured out what he was going to write, but he knew whatever it would have to be perfect. For months now, Otoya had been trying to articulate this bad news that was really weighing heavily on him to his peers and to adults and to anybody who would listen, but nobody took Otoya seriously. Adults would look at Otoya and think, oh, that's just some kid. What he's talking about can't be serious. And when Otoya would talk to classmates, they would just kind of laugh at him. Otoya frowned and he looked out the window and he thought to himself, maybe this whole time I've been coming off as too angry when I talk about this bad news. Maybe I need to change the way I talk about it to sound more sincere. And as Otoya was thinking about this, he suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I know exactly what to write. And so Otoya abandoned his tea and ran over to his brother's desk. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and he started writing. Over the last year, Otoya had felt like he had really grown up and really started to find his true self. He had been raised in a very strict household. His father was a colonel in the Japanese military, and he expected Otoya to be obedient and polite, and so that was what Otoya had done. But a couple of years earlier, Otoya had managed to secure a spot in a high school in Tokyo, far from where he had grown up, far from his father, and Otoya was really excited. He felt like going to this high school in Tokyo would finally allow him to kind of get out from under his dad's strict authoritarian rule. And his father had let him go to the high school in Tokyo, but after only a couple of weeks, it turned out Otoya's father had decided, nope, I don't want you to go there, and he had insisted that Otoya come back home and go to a Catholic school closer to their hometown. And it was at this point that Otoya, for the first time really in his whole life, he decided to push back against his dad. And so even though Otoya did come home, he did go to this Catholic school, as soon as he was home, he began constantly begging his dad to let him return to Tokyo, let him go back and live with his brother who lived in Tokyo, and let him go to the high school that he loved. And eventually, surprisingly, Otoya's father relented and said, okay, fine, you can go to Tokyo, you can do what you want. And so Otoya had been totally overjoyed. He had returned to Tokyo, gotten re-enrolled in the high school. But after only a couple of months, Otoya had kind of lost interest in the school, and instead his focus had now shifted to politics. Otoya's brother, who Otoya lived with in Tokyo, was very into politics, and he was always taking Otoya to speeches and rallies, and very quickly Otoya had gotten into it. And eventually, Otoya began to think that his purpose in life was in politics, and he just didn't like the idea of having to wait until he graduated from high school to pursue that career ambition. But when Otoya brought these ambitions up to anyone who would listen, no one took him seriously. They looked at him as a skinny, scrawny, kind of meek little guy who was not going to make a difference in the world. But Otoya begged to differ. By now, Otoya was almost done with this note he was writing, and so he looked up and he checked the clock. He saw it was 2 p.m., which meant he really needed to get going soon. He was going to go to a political debate at the Hibiya Public Hall in downtown Tokyo, and the very important person he was going to meet and deliver this bad news to was going to be at this debate. Otoya took one more look down at the note he had just written, and he read it over a couple of times, and he realized he was missing one more line at the bottom. And so he leaned down and he wrote, quote, "I can't forgive you." Feeling like he was done, he folded up the note, put it in his pocket. He stood up, he grabbed his school uniform jacket and put it on. And then he grabbed this package that he had got from his father's house and he put it under his arm. And then he headed out the front door. Otoya always loved the walk downtown. The hall where this debate was going to take place was near the Imperial Palace, and it was this big, imposing building with a terracotta and stone facade that always inspired Otoya every time he saw it. When Otoya arrived at the hall, he saw loads of people streaming in through the front doors for this debate, and so Otoya joined them and made his way inside, and he moved towards the back of the auditorium, and then he began scanning the audience. And he saw there was at least 2,000 people inside, happily chatting and laughing and waiting for this thing to start. But all Otoya could think about was where this person was that he was going to be meeting, because as he was looking around, he didn't see them. At around 2:45 p.m., the moderator of this debate walked up onto the stage down in front. He went to the podium, he grabbed the mic, and he began telling the audience to take their seats and to be quiet, and then he began to explain the rules for this debate. Otoya at this point was really only half listening because he was still looking all around the inside of this hall for this person he was going to meet. Where are they? They're not here. 15 minutes later, at around 3 p.m., the moderator left the podium and a new speaker came out on stage. He was a politician named Inajiro Asanuma, and he was the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. But when he began to speak and all the thousands of people in attendance leaned in to listen, Otoya was totally not listening because he could now see the person he was going to meet had arrived. Careful not to cause a disturbance, Otoya moved from the back of the auditorium over to the side of the building, and he began walking up a side aisle, only stopping briefly near a trash can where he pulled out that package he had brought from his father's house, and he unwrapped it and he threw the wrapping away and held on to what was inside of the package. And then Otoya looked down at what he was holding, he took a deep breath, and then he looked up and broke into a run. What happened next was broadcast live on television all across Japan, and by that evening, the footage had gone so viral that it was basically all over the world. A photographer who happened to be in the crowd of people watching this debate also happened to take a very iconic photo of what happened next involving Otoya, and that photo would actually go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1961. The Pulitzer Prize is a really big deal. It's the most prestigious award for journalism. It would turn out the very important person that Otoya was supposed to meet inside of this hall during this debate was in fact the speaker on stage at 3 p.m., Inajiro Asanuma, the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. And the package that Otoya had brought from his father's house to this meeting was a samurai sword. And so after Otoya unwrapped the sword, he took a deep breath and then ran up on stage, charged to the podium, pulled back the sword, and plunged it into Asanuma's torso before he could do anything. And the photographer out in the crowd who would win the Pulitzer happened to snap a photo right as Otoya was pulling the sword out of Asanuma and getting ready to stab him again. Onlookers would immediately rush the stage and tackle Otoya, but the damage was already done. Asanuma would pass away from his injuries within the hour. It would turn out Otoya, ever since moving to Tokyo, had become a radical right-wing ultranationalist. The note that Otoya had carefully penned and then folded up and put in his pocket before carrying out this assassination basically just said that Otoya did not hate Asanuma personally, but Asanuma was slowly transforming Japan into a communist country, and so Otoya could not forgive him for that. And so Otoya decided he needed to act. Otoya was immediately arrested, but 2 weeks later, while he was in prison, he would take his own life.
In June of 2019, an 18-year-old girl named Bella wrapped up her first year in college and headed home for the summer. Her family lived just outside of this small town in France that was tucked up in the mountains and surrounded by this huge forest. And so growing up, Bella spent a lot of her time out in this forest, either by herself or with her father or other members of her family. And so she knew the forest like the back of her hand. Her favorite place to go in this forest was the man-made lake that sat kind of at the center of this forest. It wasn't huge, but it was a beautiful view, it was very peaceful, and so she liked going out there. The way she would get to it is she would leave her house, she would hop in her car, she would drive a couple of miles down the road, and she would pull off into the shoulder of this road, and there was no signage that said this was the pull-off to get to the man-made lake. This was an area that she and her family had discovered, that there was this particular trail you could take. And so she would pull off at this shoulder, she would get out, and she would turn away from the road and just walk directly into the trees, which butted right up against the road. And very quickly, quickly, after walking into the woods, after going through some thick underbrush, she would reach this kind of clearing and she would see up ahead this little stream. And off to the left side of this stream is what looked like this kind of beaten up little footpath, but actually what it was an animal trail. So animals just kind of made their way around this area all the time, and so it kind of carved out a path. And so Bella would walk down to this animal path, and she would walk along the path that kind of went parallel with the stream, and she would walk for maybe 15 or 20 minutes until this animal path veered hard to the left, kind of went away from the stream. At that point, Bella would abandon the animal path and just continue walking along this stream, both stepping in the stream on some rocks and standing on either side when she could. And she would follow the stream due north, just going straight into the heart of this forest for about an hour, walking at a fairly leisurely pace until the stream connected with this east to west running river. And at this point, Bella would turn left, facing west, and she would follow along this riverbank about 20 minutes until the river fed into the man-made lake. And so she would stay at this lake, sitting on a rock, enjoy the view, and look at the animals and listen to nature all around her. And then at some point, she would turn around and retrace her steps all the way back to her car. For reference, one leg of this journey from car to lake or from lake to car took about 2 hours. Part of the reason Bella really enjoyed being in these woods and being at this lake was because it just kind of felt like they were hers. Because up until this summer in 2019, the only other people that Bella had ever seen anywhere in this forest or near this lake were other members of her family. So it really felt very private. So in June of that year, Bella comes home from college, and almost immediately she wants to go out to the man-made lake because she hasn't been in months. She's been in school, and so she's eager to get back to some place that she kind of considered to be her happy place. So one morning she gets up early, and by herself, she leaves her house, she hops in her car, she drives the couple miles down the road, she pulls off onto that shoulder, she parks her car, she hops out, she turns away from the road, she walks into the forest, she finds the stream and starts walking along that animal path right to the side of the stream. She walks for a few minutes until she reaches the point where the trail kind of cuts to the left, and she just stays on the stream and is just continuing walking along the stream. And about 30 minutes later, when she was maybe 1 or 2 miles short of the east-west running river, she hears a bell somewhere off in the distance, way out in front of her, out towards the river. It sounds just like a chime, a single chime. And as soon as she hears it, she stops because there's never any people out here ever, and that bell sound came from somewhere in the forest. And so she stops because she's not really sure if she actually heard that, because it could have just been her mind playing tricks on her or something. And so she stops and just kind of listens for a second, and then she starts to hear this bell just continuously start ringing. Now, the ringing was not uniform. It was constant, but it was kind of sporadic, as if you were holding a bell and kind of ringing it randomly, like you might see at a sports game. And so she's thinking to herself, is there a dog that got lost somewhere up ahead and it's got a bell on its collar, and that's the sound I'm hearing? But as she's sitting there listening to this kind of sporadic bell sound, she's thinking, that's way too loud to be some rinky-dink bell on a pet's collar. So it's got to be something more robust. Did maybe somebody have a bell inside of a box, and that box got on the river and it's floated down river and it's like crashing into rocks or something? I mean, she's going through these very strange scenarios in her head, but she's not concerned about the bell. She's actually pretty intrigued, and since the sound of this bell seemed to be coming from the direction she was already traveling, she decided she would just keep on walking and hopefully see whatever it was that was causing this bell sound. And so Bella just began walking along the stream again, kind of listening to this bell and thinking about what it was going to be. And after about 5 minutes of her starting to walk again, the bell just stops. It goes totally silent. And when it does, it actually kind of startles Bella because she'd been listening to it so intently. And so she stops and she's listening, kind of expecting it to go off some more, but it doesn't. All she hears are the sounds of nature all around her. Now, Bella didn't have an explanation for what this bell was or why it stopped, but she really just wasn't that worried about it. She figured there was some sort of explanation for it. There had to be. And so she just kind of shrugged and kept on walking and put her focus back on getting to the lake. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Bella was still walking along the stream. She was still maybe a half mile or a mile short of the east to west running river when she sees up ahead on the left side of the stream as she's walking, there appears to be something laying on the ground that looks like it could be an animal or a rock. She doesn't really know what it is. And as she gets closer, she realizes it's a beaver laying on the ground, and this beaver is missing its head. Now, this is a huge forest, and Bella would have known that, of course, there are wild animals roads all over the place, and so finding the body of an animal that had been attacked by another animal was not unusual. That's nature. But what did strike Bella as odd was the cut on this beaver's neck was unbelievably neat and uniform, as if its head had been very carefully removed with a very sharp knife. And the beaver's head was nowhere to be found. It certainly did not have the appearance of having its head removed from some predator and its teeth. That would have been very rough. Also, the rest of the beaver's body was intact, so whatever killed this beaver was not interested in eating the beaver. As Bella stood over this beaver and was just staring at it, she also noted that there was no smell. Normally, when something dies, it begins to smell very quickly. It's part of the decomposition process. And so for there not to be a smell indicated to Bella that this beaver must have been killed fairly recently. And then when Bella kind of gently prodded the body with her foot, she realized the beaver's body was still fairly limp, so rigor mortis had not set in. Rigor mortis is another part of the decomposition process where the body kind of stiffens up, and that happens fairly soon after death. And so as Bella is realizing this beaver must have died very recently, it dawns on her that most likely whoever or whatever has killed this beaver is probably somewhere nearby. And Bella can't help but connect this dead beaver to that bell she was hearing earlier, which before meant nothing, but considering the bell was roughly coming from the same area where this beaver has now been found, it made her uneasy. And so Bella found herself whipping her head around, looking out into the trees, seeing if, there's some person, a hunter or somebody that would kind of explain what was going on, but there was nothing. And so Bella felt herself starting to panic a little bit, but then she stopped herself and said, "Calm down, it's broad daylight. I have been coming to these woods for years and years. I've never seen another person. I've never encountered some predatory animal. I'm sure everything is perfectly fine. I got nothing to worry about." And so she stepped over the beaver and kept on walking. Bella would eventually reach the east-west running river. She would turn left and walk for 20 minutes alongside this river. She'd reach the man-made lake. She enjoyed the beautiful view and the scenery, and then at some point she turned around and began retracing her footsteps. She walked past the beaver on the ground all the way back to her car, and she went home. A week later, Bella was sitting around her house when she felt pretty bored and decided kind of abruptly that in order to cure her boredom, she would go back to the place she loved so much, the man-made lake. And so she told her parents where she was going, and then she left the house, hopped in her car, drove to the pull-off and parked and entered the woods at 6 p.m. Sunset that night was at 9 p.m. and so Bella knew this would need to be a fairly quick turnaround so she didn't get trapped in the woods in the dark. And so Bella finds the animal trail. She follows along the stream until the trail goes left and she stays on the stream. She continues walking on the stream when she starts to hear the distant sound of thunder. And so she looks up into the sky through the trees and she can see the sky is starting to get dark, but she's still a couple of hours away from sunset. And so between the thunder and the dark skies, she knows a storm is rolling in. But she is determined to get to that lake. And so instead of, turning around and saying, okay, I'll come back another time, she just starts jogging along the stream to get there as fast as she possibly can. And almost immediately as she's jogging, the raindrops start to fall. And by the time she passes the beaver corpse on the ground, it hadn't moved, the rain was really coming down, and then about 15 minutes after the corpse, when she hit the east-west running river, that's when the rain was at a full downpour. Still, Bella turned at the river and continued west towards the man-made lake as if she was going to go all the way, but only about a minute or two into this final leg. She still had about 20 minutes to get to the lake. She stops herself and she looks at her watch and she can see it's after 8 o'clock already. And she's thinking to herself, if I turn around right now, it's going to take me over an hour to get back to my car. Sunsets at 9 p.m. It's after 8 p.m. now. So already I know I'm going to have to navigate this forest at night in the dark, even if it's just for a little bit at the end. And if I go all the way to the lake and then come all the way back to the car, I'm going to be in the forest after dark for quite a while, maybe up to an hour. And she's thinking, I'm confident I can do that, but it's also pouring rain, I'm cold. If I get lost, this could turn into a very bad situation. And so she ultimately decides that even though she really wants to keep going, she needs to turn around, she needs to head back. And so she turns around and she walks back up alongside this east-west running river to where the stream fed into that river. She turns and begins walking south along this stream, headed back towards the car. On her walk, because the visibility was starting to get quite bad because it was so dark, she had her head down at the ground because she didn't want to trip. She's stepping on rocks, she's stepping on muddy areas. She wants to make sure her footing is solid. And so her head is down, the rain is pounding all around her, and she's walking for about 15 minutes when all of a sudden something hits her her in the top of the head. And so reflexively, she looks up and kind of puts her hands in front of her face to protect herself, and she sees what she had just run into. It was the beaver corpse. It was hanging from a string that was dangling off a branch right above her. And this beaver's head had been retrieved, and the head had been stitched onto the front paws of this beaver. And so she's looking at this beaver that's dangling from this rope. It's carrying its own head, and she's walked square into it. And her first reaction was basically to gag. She was going to vomit. She was so disgusted. And then she began frantically rubbing at her hair where this thing had made contact with her, because there could be juices from the decomposition that got on her. And then after frantically kind of patting at her head for a second, she stops, and something really terrifying dawns on her. Whoever strung this beaver up to this tree and then stitched its head onto its paws, they had done that in the last 30 minutes, because 30 minutes earlier, when she was on her way in, she remembered passing the beaver carcass on the ground. She saw it. It had not moved from where it was the week before when she first saw it, and now this beaver is strung up in the tree. And so as the wheels are turning in Bella's head, she realizes that if someone has just done this, then they are probably nearby. And at this point, it's really starting to get dark. The rain is pounding all around her, and she starts whipping her head around, looking in all directions to see if there's someone out there that did this. But as she's looking, all she sees is just dark forest in all directions. And she knows she's at least 1 hour, even if she runs from her car. And so suddenly she is totally panicked. And in an effort to calm herself down, she says to herself, okay, I need to get out of here, but I have to walk. If I start running right now, this is going to turn into a complete nightmare. I just have to try to walk. And so she walks around this dangling beaver corpse and starts walking along the stream. And as soon as she's past that corpse, she feels the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She can hear movement behind her. She doesn't know what it is. It could be a deer, it could be some animal, but she's too afraid to turn around. And even though she was trying to tell herself to calm down, just keep walking, you're safe, you're freaking yourself out, everything is okay, as she's walking, she could feel herself starting to speed up until finally she was just running down this stream, sprinting actually away from this beaver and whatever it was that was moving around in that area. And at some point, she got so winded from sprinting so fast that she came to a stop, maybe 5 or 6 minutes after seeing this beaver. And as soon as she comes to a stop and she's walking, she still hasn't turned around yet, she hears the sound of that bell. And right away, it's the exact same sound she had heard the week before. It's that kind of constant, sporadic sound of someone ringing a bell. But in her panic state, she doesn't know where it's coming from. She's so scared. Her anxiety is so high. She doesn't know if it's behind her or if it's off to the side. It's now completely dark out. And so she is full-blown terrified. There is someone or something behind her that has strung this beaver up that's probably watching her, and she can't see them. Even though she's beyond winded, she can barely breathe. She just starts sprinting as fast as she can. And as she's stumbling and falling on the rocks and tripping because she's not really looking where she's going, in the background and all around her, she's hearing this bell chiming and she's hearing something moving around in the woods behind her. And she pulls her phone out of her pocket, her iPhone, and as she's running, she dials her father. She puts the phone to her ear. She's crying. She's panting. She can barely breathe. Her father picks up and she's so relieved to hear his voice, but she can't even make a sentence. She just starts crying and wailing and pleading with him, "Dad, come out to the forest. Meet me at the spot where the trail veers away from the stream. Meet me there. There's someone in the forest that's chasing me and I can't see them." Her father on the other end of the phone, he didn't know what to make of this, but he could hear the primal fear in his daughter's voice. And so he didn't ask any questions. He said, "Stay on the line. I'm coming to meet you right now." So Bella's father and mother, with Bella on the line, they run out of their house. They hop in their car. They speed the couple miles down the road. They park next to their daughter's car. And as they're running into the woods, they can hear way off in the woods the sound of the bell. They can hear the bell. They hear their daughter screaming on the phone. They can hear the bell coming through the phone, and she's begging them to please come into the woods, come in here, save me. And so the parents run into the woods and they begin running up the stream. Meanwhile, Bella, who's way out in the woods, she's still 10 or 15 minutes away from her parents. She is barely able to run at this point. She's exhausted almost all of her energy. And as she's getting closer and closer to her parents, the sporadic bell sound is getting louder and louder and louder, like whatever it is is gaining on her, and she can hear behind her all these sticks and branches. They're breaking as if something is coming up to her. And finally, when it feels like this bell is right behind her head, she just kind of stops in defeat. She's too far away from her parents. She can't get to them in time. And so it was almost like she had to turn around and finally look at whatever it was that was behind her. And so terrified beyond words, Bella, who can barely breathe, she's so scared and so tired, she slowly turns around. Now, when she turns around and she's facing the other direction, she's looking across this clearing. She just happened to run past this clearing, and because it was a clearing, there was a little bit of moonlight that was coming down through the trees, just enough to illuminate this space that was about 50 feet wide. And as she's looking across this clearing, at first, she doesn't see anything. And then this tall, dark figure walks into the clearing, and as soon as it steps in, she can see it's got a bell at its waist, and with every step it took, it would violently ring the bell, causing the ringing sound. And so this thing starts moving into the clearing, and as Bella is staring at it, it was like time slowed down. She could not process what she was looking at. She didn't know what she was looking at. All she knew is whatever or whoever this is, they're coming straight at me. And so Bella suddenly got this unbelievable adrenaline rush. It was like her body went into autopilot to save her, and she turned around and began sprinting faster than she'd ever sprinted in her life. And as she ran, all she could hear was the sound of that bell, which she now knew represented steps this thing was taking. And so the bell was getting faster and faster and louder, and she knew it was gaining on her. And she began lying and screaming out loud that, "I'm on the phone with the police. They're right up ahead. They're going to be here any moment." But whatever it was that was behind her, they weren't fazed. They were just charging ahead, gaining on her second by second. Meanwhile, her parents had made it to the meeting spot, but her father, he felt like, I can't just sit here. And he just starts charging into the woods. He can hear his daughter screaming. He can hear this bell getting louder and louder. He just starts running towards it. And sure enough, seconds later, he sees his daughter come bounding out of the forest, and she leaps into his arms. He just grabs her, turns around, and runs with her back to the meeting spot. He grabs his wife, and the three of them just charge out of the forest, back to the parking lot, back in their car, and they speed off. In the car, all of them are crying. They don't know what to make of what just happened. Bella's trying to describe it, but she can't. And her parents, they had been on the phone listening to their daughter screaming, and all they kept saying to each other, the parents, was, "I heard the bell. I heard the bell. I heard the bell," as if the bell confirmed their worst nightmares, that there really was someone or something out in those woods that was trying to do harm to their child. They would drive straight to the police station where Bella would file a report about what she experienced out in the forest, and then afterwards her parents, as a precaution, took her to the hospital where she was determined to be okay, besides some bumps and bruises from falling down. The following morning, the police went out to the forest, to the area where Bella had explained where she had been, and they searched all along that animal foot trail and all along the stream, but they never found any sign of this dark figure with the bell. Bella would tell police that she had a handbag, and as she was running back, she dropped the bag. She remembered where she dropped it along the stream, but when the police went to that area, the bag was gone. Also, the beaver was no longer there. It was not tied up to the tree. It was not on the ground. It was gone. The only thing police found that was out of the ordinary was they found a little ways off from the stream, basically along the path that Bella would have been running on, they found a t-shirt neatly folded, placed underneath a rock. But the police and Bella and her family have no idea what that signifies. Ultimately, the police told Bella and her family that more than likely what she ran into was some kind of mentally unstable person that was living out in the woods, and perhaps when Bella came into the woods, they felt like she was on their property, and so they kind of tried to scare her off. But Bella has a hard time accepting that. She felt like, as she was running from whoever was behind her, that she was in mortal danger. That had it not been for her father running into the woods and literally grabbing her and running with her the rest of the way, that she may not have gotten out of the woods at all, that she might have been attacked and killed by whoever this was. She also can't help, when she looks back at the entire experience, thinking about that moment when she turned around and looked across that clearing and saw this figure come into the moonlight for the first time, that when it came into the moonlight, the way it was moving, the steps it was taking, they weren't normal, they were abnormal. There was just something off about this thing's movement, that it didn't seem like she was looking at a person, but rather some big animal. But regardless, since her ordeal, there have been no strange sightings out in those woods. However, almost no one ever goes in those woods except for Bella and her family, and Bella and her family, they don't go in those woods anymore. So whoever or whatever is out there is still just out